Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good evening and welcome to the No Treason Podcast. This is episode 16. I'm your host, Jonathan Drake, and we are live tonight. And as you can see, I have spruced up the studio just a smidge. We're in an LED bar back behind me. So I chose blue so that it's a little more pleasing to the eyes, more calming as we go through these topics of spooners that tend to rankle people's deep-rooted statism. So that look at the blue lights and just calm yourself down. I hope everyone is doing well. We had about 12 inches of snow over this past couple of days. My kids are enjoying it. My back, not necessarily after shelling the driveway. I do have a snowblower, but I didn't really feel like dragging it out of the back shed, and I need a little exercise, so it all worked out. Very cold. It's a winter storm unlike anyone has ever seen before. I believe this is the first winter we have ever actually had, if you are to take the news reports about it seriously. It's terrifying out there. So, you gotta just stay inside, look at your screens, get all your information from the TV, let them do all your thinking. You don't want to, hurt a brain muscle or something like that. But, or you know what, switch over to this TV and I will berate you for just taking my word for it and encourage you all to do your own thinking. But to help you with that, we do have some awesome people throughout history that we can draw on. And my favorite happens to be a Lysander Spooner. We're going through his essay, Trial by Jury. I've mentioned before that his essay is rather hilariously called an essay. They clearly had different standards for what counts as an essay back in the 1850s. It's a book. It's like 180 pages or 190 pages or something like that in the PDF that I've got. Which, to that point, if you go into the description of the episode each week, that the trial by jury essay is in there, as well as the other foundational works of Spooners that we've touched on so far, primarily No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, number 6. I believe 1 and 2 are still in there. Highly recommend reading all of those things, and then follow along the show as we break these things down. But last week, in going through trial by jury, we discussed how weak the regal authority really was in the Anglo-Saxon political system. Our modern notion, which is a one-size-fits-all notion, that a monarch is the totalitarian voice of law and custom within his realm, most certainly did not apply to those ancient kings. They were guardians of the law. They were not the originators or the source of it. There certainly have been cases of that throughout history, but at least in the Anglo-Saxon period, that was not the case. I don't know how to pronounce your screen name. G.A. Nana, maybe? Georgia Nana. This is live. We are live this evening. Good to see everybody in the chat. I will do my best to keep my eye on it, but I also have I could never read 2 lines of music. I grew up playing the piano. I loved playing ragtime music. I could never read two lines at the same time, so I can't like split my brain in that regard. So I'll do my best to keep an eye on things, but I appreciate you all for joining me. But legal power, going back to the introduction here, legal power being the ability to enforce the law, and thus the true thermostat of liberty in a society, was in the Anglo-Saxon period decentralized into a series of progressively sized courts that met on a frequent basis. And they placed the power of justice, and thus liberty, firmly into the hands of the people. Even the proto-parliament, the Witena Gamot or Witena Yamot or Witten, however you want to remember that, this was a collection of bishops and barons that served as an advisor to the king. They did not possess binding legislative authority. Every once in a while, they were referenced by the king to aid him in his bid to persuade the people on particulars of a given law if he wanted to introduce a new law to the country. If those men demonstrated wisdom and were thus known as wise counselors by the people, so they had a good reputation, then their stamp of approval on any given law by the king might cause it was never a given, to be included in the enforceable codes of the land. This was the custom back on the continent, and Spooner quoted a number of British historians who, drawing upon Anglo-Saxon first-hand sources, argued that once the Saxons arrived in Britain, they were not likely to have abandoned their fiercely held principles of personal sovereignty by surrendering them into the hands of a totalitarian despot. So change of location did not equal change of ideology. And I mentioned that last week, that we see this when people move from state to state, and leftists leave the disaster their policies leave behind, and then they don't have the wherewithal to have recognized the personal accountability that their own choices played a role in destroying the state they left. And so they continue those in the state that they arrive into. Well, on the good side of things, the Saxons did that when they were initially invited to England or Britain as mercenaries, and then decided to just make a permanent home forcefully. They weren't all great, but they had good ideas when it comes to personal sovereignty. So tonight we're going to take a look at how those generous barbarians, which I believe was the way David Hume referenced them, we'll see how they actually conducted their courts, relying on randomly selected juries to judge by conscience and not by royal fiat. But first, we have some sponsors. And first up, Badlands or Badlanders. You are all familiar with Loaded Gun Coffee. They have been longtime supporters of Badlands, and you may have met them in person at GART. But did you know they are a veteran-ran, family-owned shop in Lake Havasu, Arizona? Every bag of their whole bean coffee delivers a high-octane, patriotic punch of flavor. With a long family history of commitment to freedom, every bag is a testament of pride and honor. From the skilled farmers who cultivate each blend, to their roasters that handpick the finest coffee beans from around the world, Loaded Gun Coffee has mastered their unique brewing methods, resulting in the best tasting coffee around. And I totally blew the timing on this video, but their coffee is smooth and delicious, the perfect way to start your mornings. Get over to badlandsmedia.tv/loaded. Use promo code Badlands to get 10% off your order. If you are in the Lake Havasu area, stop in their newly renovated store and say hi. That's badlandsmedia.tv/loaded. Promo code Badlands. Stay loaded with Loaded Gun Coffee. And speaking of GART, we've got Nashville coming up April 9th through 12th. Tickets are available now. You go to badlands.tv/events. I am really looking forward to that one. Ash and I are working with Brian CanCon to come up with a trial by jury immersive experience to reinforce these important concepts. So stay tuned for that. That'll be an in-person. We might try to do something that could be made use of by virtual ticket holders, but certainly hope to see you all there. If you do come, make sure you come up and say hi. Next up, we've got the InfoWar Quartermaster.
I'm excited to announce that we're having our biggest Made in America sale ever. We just put huge discounts on products made right here in the USA. My Pillow bed pillows, body pillows, go anywhere pillows, bolster pillows, all made with my patented adjustable fill. Mattresses, mattress toppers, mattress pads, adjustable bed frames, mattress foundations, and so much more. All made right here in the USA. And now we're expanding our USA products beyond just quality sleep. Like the cross I wear every day, now available in both men's and women's. We even have USA-made socks. And are you tired of being tired? Try our new health beverage, Rev 7. Or how about my coffee, the greatest coffee ever. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use this promo code to get deep discounts on all these products. Plus, for a limited time, your order ships absolutely free.
And then, of course, last but not least, we have Badlands' very own soft disclosure.
I don't say this lightly. This lotion changes people.
My knuckles would actually start to crack. Started using the soft disclosure lotion, and I am very impressed. Even within just a few days, I've noticed a tremendous difference.
That's not a script. That's what happens when something actually works.
It puts the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
Yeah, that line keeps coming up. Because when you don't use it, your skin starts acting up.
Every single ingredient in soft disclosure is intentionally chosen. There's no filler ingredients. It is not like this BS product where they have a bunch of ingredients. Every ingredient listed is for a purpose.
Over 65-star reviews for the lotion alone. Not influencers, not actors, just people whose skin finally shut up. Soft disclosure lotion. Once you try it, you'll understand why people won't stop talking about it. Visit softdisclosure.com and use code Badlands and get 10% off.
That ad just goes to show you that what you say on Badlands can and will be used in a advertisement. Gotta be careful what you talk about. We're live tonight. Good to see everyone in the chat. Polymathanon showed up finally. AOB, you guys got 21 inches of snow. Wow. I know a lot of people are getting hit. And I remember as a kid, the thought of 21 inches of snow was, boy, that was the stuff of dreams. As an adult, I don't mind snow. I know Polymath hates cold and snow. I don't mind snow. It's beautiful, but I definitely am not appreciative of having to deal with driving in it. Thankfully, I didn't have to work this weekend, so I didn't have to really worry about that. And, but, still get some exercise out there shoveling. So anyway, coming inside and your hands are tired and cracked, put some soft disclosure on, because that's what I do. Last week, we covered Chapter 3, Additional Proofs of the Rights and Duties of Jurors, and we started in Section 1, titled Weakness of Regal Authority. Skeptical has at least 15 inches of snow, still snowing. Yeah, that's it's amazing how we've never had storms like this ever before. You go back and read, I don't know if anyone has ever read James Michener. It was a book, Centennial, I think. My mom read that to us when we were kids, part of historical, I think we were studying the Old West or something in homeschool. And the winters that were described in that book were like, it would snow in the Midwest and be like 2 feet on the ground and just stay all winter. And I remember as a kid thinking that'd be awesome. But so maybe we're getting back to that. I don't know. But tonight we're going to look at Section 2, which is entitled The Ancient Common Law Juries Were Mere Courts of Conscience. So this is part of Spooner building his case for trial by jury being the way that he defines it being. The first couple of episodes, we talked about this a little bit last week, were defining the actions of a jury the way they should be. And then everything since then has been him building his case beyond the logic stemming from natural law. This is building his case from history. We inherited this from English common law, which inherited this from the Anglo-Saxon era, and they kept records to an extent enough that we can push back against the attempts to redefine it today, which is what we are dealing with. And they got me thinking, why did Spooner write this essay? Apart from just fleshing out his own ideas, I know that's helpful. I'm a verbal processor myself, and so I know it's helpful to put things down on paper. But I think when you think about it, by the time that he wrote this essay, it was published in 1852, the colloquial understanding of what was available to the common American in trial by jury had already pretty much been lost. Complacency in the American populace, I've been arguing, had been fostered by the idea that a piece of paper had secured for all time the liberty that we once held dear, or claimed and still claim to hold dear, but the mechanisms had been subverted by a misplaced focus on the means by which liberty could be secured. Aggressive redefinition of the practice had already been effected by the time Spooner wrote his essay by an increasingly dominant judicial branch leaning heavily on judicial review. So I think his goal, as far as I can tell, was to aggregate into one document from many and disparate and difficult to parse through legal sources, a thorough treatise that could be used to regain that understanding and provide a textbook for educating future generations. And even if we determine that such historical sources aren't worth putting stock into, I'm certainly open to that idea that this is even part of, thinking through Chris Paul's idea of the history of the fake news of today is the history of tomorrow. So maybe this was fake news that the Anglo-Saxons did this. So even if that's true, Spooner makes a solid case from the standpoint of natural law, under which is the right to resist tyranny, whether by individuals or government. And so if our liberty then is the highest priority in this country, then trial by jury must be as we are defining and discussing here, and we need to bring it back. As such, we are beneficiaries of Spooner's wisdom and his effort. What we do with his wisdom and his effort is obviously entirely up to us. We like to say, Trump likes to say, that we are a nation built on the rule of law. That's a phrase that can be a hallmark of liberty, or, as I believe it is primarily used, it's simply a moral platitude used to justify tyranny. To that end, Spooner writes, but it is in the administration of justice or of law that the freedom or subjection of a people is tested. If this administration be in accordance with the arbitrary will of the legislator, that is, if his will as it appears in his statutes be the highest rule of decision known to the judicial tribunals, the government is a despotism, and the people are slaves. If, on the other hand, the rule of decision be those principles of natural equity and justice, which constitute, or at least are embodied in, the general conscience of mankind, the people are free in just so far as that conscience is enlightened. And therein lies the moral basis for juries judging on conscience, and that's what we're going to be looking into, is how that was understood during the Anglo-Saxon time. And it's possible from a moral standpoint because, as I've made the case before, the Apostle Paul says that the law of God is written on our hearts. And this gets into a lot of the objections that people will have regarding trial by jury, judging the law, not just the person accused. And if the jury is not qualified, as some people would argue, to be the final tribunal that the legislator must satisfy, then that raises some serious questions about the nature of our system. And I'll say our system. By what qualification does the legislator or a judge sitting on a bench claim a superior authority on matters of law to the jury? Is it because they've received some diploma from a school that perpetuates statist ideas by indoctrinating its students into the nuances of their never-ending and difficult to understand rules and language? Maybe they passed an exam proctored by the state, and that makes them qualified. A lot of congressmen and senators have a background in law. Or maybe their qualification comes from the fact that they were elected. At this point, does anyone really want to put faith in our elections? I would remind you that even if the votes were faithfully counted, and you could have a 100% guarantee that there would be zero fraud, one person, one vote, even if it was fully transparent, elections are not capable of providing the consent required for a legitimate government. If we all agree that a legitimate government, or the only legitimate government, is one that governs by consent. Voting cannot provide consent. And that is fleshed out thoroughly in the 10 reasons that Spooner gives for why voting doesn't equal consent. And if you want a review on that, go back and listen to episode 2, which is covering section 2 of the No Treason number 6 essay. In light of all of that, of, for, and by the people cannot mean the delegation or the abdication of the security of the people's individual liberty into the hands of a professional expert class. And I say individual liberty because, as Spooner aptly points out, individual liberty is collective liberty. But the opposite is not true. Collective liberty is not individual liberty. Thinking of the general will and other terms that people use to justify their totalitarian actions. I quoted this in, I think it's episode 14, but Spooner wrote in this way, speaking of juries: they took the liberties of each individual, and thus the liberties of the whole people, entirely out of the hands of the king and out of the power of his laws, and placed them in the keeping of the people themselves. If you violate a person's individual liberty, you are violating the liberty of everyone. But the idea that the only people qualified to speak on the legitimacy of any given law is this expert class, and those are the only people that we're allowed to essentially elect, or that once the people are elected, then they have to submit to the advice and the counsel of experts, as is often the case in legal proceedings. We just got a raid from Viva Frey. Welcome, everybody. That is not government. That is government by experts, not government by the people. Being permitted to choose which expert wields arbitrary authority over us, which is unquestionable authority when you factor in the speech and debate clause, that's not government by the people. We've been duped into thinking that it is, and as such, we've been duped into forgetting our trial by jury heritage, that we, the people, as individuals, are the final tribunal that all law must satisfy. And that satisfaction is not and cannot be achieved at the ballot. And that's not some new phenomenon. I believe, I'm firmly convinced that that's the way it's always been. It's only achieved where the rubber of the judicial enforcement meets the road of a randomly selected jury of the people, exercising their natural rights to resist tyranny by nullifying the law of tyrants. This is what the Anglo-Saxons realized and fiercely stood their ground against. And they did it by sitting on juries, guided by their God-given consciences. To that end, Spooner writes, "It is manifest from all the accounts we have of the courts in which juries sat prior to Magna Carta, such as the court baron, the 100 court, the court leet, we mentioned some of these last week, the county court, that they were mere courts of conscience, and that the juries were the judges deciding causes according to their own notions of equity and not according to any laws of the king, unless they thought them just." I listed a few of these courts I said last week, and they would meet on a regular basis. And as you dig into them, you realize they had quite a number of these different styles of courts, and they were designed to handle all the different types of issues and common offenses that people might bring against each other. And they met on a regular basis so that people desiring justice, or those on whom justice needed served, did not have to wait an inordinate amount of time to have their cases heard. You think about the way we have it today and how long the legal process really takes. And that in of itself is a usurpation of justice. And that was not something that the average Anglo-Saxon had to deal with. And part of that was because when the jury was the one adjudicating the law itself as well, you didn't have to have some special class of person who has spent their entire life studying legal precedent. You just had to know natural law in and of yourself. Did this person violate the natural rights of someone else? That's easy to figure out. You don't need to parse through hundreds of years and thousands of cases and quote this one versus that one and have your precedent here and all. You didn't have to worry about that kind of stuff as much as you do today, because the judge was a mere advisor. The judge would advise the jury if they had questions. And we'll get into some of that a little bit later. Because the courts were judged on basis of cultural custom rooted in natural law, as I mentioned, the tedious task we see today of parsing through centuries of precedent and case law was unnecessary. These courts, it must be considered, were very numerous and held very frequent sessions. They were probably 7, 8, or 9. The way this reads, it sounds like 900 of these, but it's 7, 8, or 900 courts, 100 court being one of the styles of courts in the kingdom. The object being, as Blackstone, that's William Blackstone, the object being, as Blackstone says, to bring justice home to every man's door. And welcome again to those who raided from Viva Frey. Appreciate you guys coming on over. We're discussing Lysander Spooner's essay, Trial by Jury, in an attempt to bring back proper trial by jury as we once had it in this country, and the way it was understood historically, that the jury is not just the finder of fact, not just the determining whether or not someone did or did not commit a crime, but actually judging the law itself. And as such, it was referred to by British legal historians of the 17 and 1800s and earlier as the Palladium of liberty, the security, the defense of liberty. And more than anything else available to us as a people desiring to be free, it is the best way to resist tyranny, short of full-on, is it Fry? Sorry, Claire. But short of armed rebellion, if you would prefer not to do that, then trial by jury is where it's at. In the second place, moving on, it is manifest that the principles of law by which the juries determined causes were, as a general rule, nothing else than their own ideas of natural equity, and not any laws of the king, because but few laws were enacted, and many of those were not written, but only agreed upon in council. Of those that were written, few copies only were made, printing then being unknown, and not enough to supply all or any considerable number of these courts. And even if they had prolific publishing capabilities, few or none of the jurors could have read the laws if they had been written, because few or none of the common people could at that time read. And even if they could read in their native tongue, Mackintosh says the first act of the House of Commons composed and recorded in the English tongue was in 1415, 2 centuries after Magna Carta. And if you recall from last week, even those that were written down, Spooner marvels that the law codes of the Anglo-Saxons that we have that are preserved would not amount to any more than about 12 pages of any given state's law book. He highlighted Massachusetts in the 1850s. The first English law being recorded in 1415. Prior to that, all laws were primarily written in Latin, occasionally in French, especially once the Normans took over. And Lion of Britain, you're right, the common law is unwritten, by the way. It's something you learn as a child. We'll go in more depth into natural law. I'm going to go through the essay, Natural Law, the Science of Justice, at some point, following probably the discussion that Polymathenon and I are going to have after trial by jury on ether physics, which I'm very much looking forward to. And for those of you joining from the raid, if that seems like a complete departure from these more political discussions, the purpose of this show is to discuss anything that would be considered treasonous to the official narrative of whatever. I started with Spooner because I deeply appreciate his ideas and commentary on natural law and on justice. And the name of this show is an homage to Spooner's No Treason essay, which you can find discussions on in the first 10 episodes of this show. Mackintosh, I just quoted there, was another British contemporary of Spooner's. He studied the English legal history, and he was considered a, authoritative, whatever that means, at least at that time. Officers of the court, potentially elected, but in many cases were just appointed by the king. They served as the instigating organizer of the court proceedings. And really, the elections of them it's irrelevant so long as the people maintained their courts of conscience. I tried finding any sort of indication as far as if they were elected in some way, how did they go about doing that? It doesn't seem, at least what I could find, any record of that. But as I just said here, I don't think it's even really important if someone is appointed or elected, so long as the people maintain their right of natural resistance embodied in a trial by jury, aka court of conscience. Spooner quotes the mirror of justice, further elaborating on how these courts functioned. He writes, the sheriffs and bailiffs caused the free tenants of their bailiwicks to meet at their counties and hundreds. Those are a couple of the different types of courts, at which justice was so done that everyone so judged his neighbor by such judgment as a man could not elsewhere receive in the like cases, until such times as the customs of the realm were put in writing and certainly published. And although a free man commonly was not to serve as a juror or a judge without his assent, that's something that Spooner will talk about more later, nevertheless it was assented unto that free tenants should meet together in the counties and hundreds and lords' courts, if they were not specially exempted to do such suits, and there judged their neighbors. This is quoting from the Mirror of Justices, Spooner does. And the Mirror of Justices was a late 13th century accounting of English legal practices as they were at the time of that writing, so late 1300s or 13th century. So within 100 years after Magna Carta. And it was writing basically fondly looking back to the way things were, even at that time. Now, going back to the illiteracy and the lack of readily available written codes, the regular court proceedings were also partially done so that they were able to constantly engage the people in the active governance of their lands, sort of like the concept, if you don't use it, you lose it. But elected or not, these officers of the court were not a source of judgment. They merely either organized the courts, but then they especially were the facilitators of the judgment of the juries. Reeves, that is John Reeves, or John Reeve, I think it is. Might be a typo there. He was a English historian, wrote a book called The History of English Law, and that's what Spooner is quoting here. He says, the great court for civil business was the county court, held once every 4 weeks. Here the sheriff presided, but the suitors of the court, as they were called, that is, the freemen or landholders of the county, were the judges. And the sheriff was to execute the judgment. Furthering the idea that the officers of the court were merely administrative and executors of the judgment of the juries, Spooner quotes the Political Dictionary, which was a large encyclopedia dictionary of legal terminology and such, written by a certain Charles James. And it was, if you were in law school at that time, you would have referenced this in any sort of legal proceedings. This was looked at as an authoritative definitional resource. It says, in the case of freeholders attending as suitors, the county court or court baron, as in the case of the ancient tenants per baronium attending parliament, the suitors are the judges of the court, both for law and for fact, and the sheriff or the under-sheriff in the county court, and the lord or his steward in the court baron are only presiding officers with no judicial authority. That is so much different than we have today. Here you enter into a courtroom and it's the judge's court. And if you dare look at him sideways, he'll hold you in contempt and all this other kind of nonsense. They sit as many god kings up on their pedestal, and it's disgusting. But going back to these courts being courts of conscience, Spooner quotes from Glanville. All the ancient writs given in Glanville for summoning jurors indicate that the jurors judged of everything on their consciences only. And the writs are in this form. So this is Glanville. This is Ranulph de Glanville. He was a French, I believe he was a French historian, or it gets kind of dicey because after the Norman invasion, a lot of the English elites end up having French last names because they all came over from Normandy. But he wrote a procedural manual of the courts of the time in the late 12th century. So he is late 1100s. And this is a heavy reference for many of the British legal minds that Spooner references that were either his contemporaries or wrote prior to his day. And they were seeking to revitalize or at least comment on trial by jury. So this is a common practice being recorded by de Glanville. He says here, summon 12 free and legal men, or sometimes 12 knights, to be in court, prepared upon their oaths to declare whether A or B have the greater right to the land or other thing in question. So this is talking about how juries were summoned, at least in some cases. By the way, the book that this is quoted from is the original title is in Latin, but the English translation is The Treatise on the Laws and Customs of the Kingdom of England. The officers of the court, either appointed by the king or the baron on whose estate the court was gathered, served also as advisors of the law, but not determiners of it. So they were organizers, they were executors of the judgment, But then in the court proceedings itself, especially if those had gained some notoriety in a good way for understanding the concepts of English law, of all the ins and outs and what have you, then they would be looked upon as advisors. Ad questionium juris non respondent juratores, I'm sure I butchered that. That translated is, to the question of law, the jurors do not answer. The Anarchist says that this is indeed a maxim in the civil law jurisprudence, but it does not bind an English jury. For by the common law of the land, the jury are judges as well as the matter of the law as of fact, with this difference only, that the judge on the bench is to give them no assistance in determining the matter of fact, but if they have any doubt among themselves relating to matter of law, they may then request him to explain it to them, which when he hath done, and they are thus become well informed, they, and they only, become competent judges of the matter of law. And this is the province of the judge on the bench, namely to show or teach the law, but not to take upon him the trial of the delinquent, either in matter of fact or in matter of law. This is from Jeffrey Gilbert's History of the Common Pleas. Think about the way, going back to the Tina Peters case and hundreds of thousands of other cases that had exact similar circumstances, wherein the judge decides which evidence is permissible. The judge decides which arguments are relevant. That's not the prerogative of the judge in a true trial by jury system. That's how Tina Peters got railroaded, because the jury was not allowed to hear arguments that would have exonerated her in the same way. I used this example back then when I was talking about the Tina Peters trial. What happened to her is like if someone saw a vehicle go off of a bridge into the water and they see there's a child trapped inside the car, and they jump down there and they smash the window, which technically is against the law. You're breaking and destroying someone's property, but they did so in order to save the child. And then the judge, this person gets arrested for destroying property, and the judge doesn't allow the jury to hear the defendant say, I was trying to save this kid who was drowning. That's relevant information. In the Tina Peters trial, the judge did not let the jury hear her side of things, her argument that was relevant. And ultimately, that's why what we have today is a usurpation of what this originally was meant to be. And so when you have the governor of Colorado coming out and saying that she was tried by a jury of her peers, that's bullshit. That's not true. All they were doing was regurgitating basically the line that was given to them. You may read these things here. You may think these things here. You may do these things here. That's not a court of conscience. That's not what trial by jury was originally meant to be. And that's the way it used to be. It was in this country. It has been usurped. And we have to take this back. If we ever want to live in a truly golden age, we have to take this back. The principle of the jury, this is further evidence that officers of the court were the tools in the hands of the jury rather than the other way around as it is today. The principle of the jury was therefore not confined to its mere application as a mode of trying contested facts, whether in civil or criminal cases, and both in its form and its consequences, it had a very material influence upon the general constitution of the realm. And that would make sense. If you have a jury that actually is determining what is or what isn't law, that's going to have a dramatic impact on the constitution of the realm. Little Beth is late, Polymath. She always is. No, someone needs to remind her. Rodent dung, I would say that the Tina Peters trial was not a kangaroo court, because that would be an insult to kangaroos. Going on with this quote, the mainspring of the machinery of remedial justice existed in the franchise of the lower and lowest orders of the political hierarchy. Without the suffrage, in this case, it is suffrage obviously means voting, but in this case, it is referring to their activity on a jury. Without the suffrage of the yeoman, the burgess, and the churl, the sovereign could not exercise the most important and most essential function of royalty. From them, he received the power of life and death. He could not wield the sword of justice until the humblest of his subjects placed the weapon in his hand. That demonstrates the tremendous power that a jury actually has, and demonstrates inversely the complete lack of power that the sovereign has, that the king has. This is why it doesn't matter if we have a king. It doesn't matter if we have a king that we think is not a king because we call it a president, or we have a king that we think is not a king because it's dispersed among a bunch of quote unquote representatives that can't actually prove in court whether or not anyone actually voted for them because of the secret ballot. And even if they can prove that those people voted for them, all that proves is that those people voted for them, and therefore they only would be allowed to represent those people and not the people that voted against them or chose not to vote because they decided they didn't want to participate in a rigged system or a system in which the power of the state was used against their neighbor. They didn't want any of that. Those representatives are only representative of those people. Therefore, they're the king of those people. It doesn't matter if any of those things. If we have what is described here, where the jury is the one that decides the constitution of the realm, and I don't mean constitution as like a document, I mean the actual, like the things that constitute the nature of our society, the things that we look at as being law, the things that we recognize as being enforceable custom. If a jury exercises its authority in that regard, what a power. And then the king is standing there like, hey, where do I swing the sword? That goes back to, which I'd like to get into this at some point, maybe do an episode or two on the biblical case for the state. If you take Romans 13 even, and you look at what God gave governments the authority to do, I don't think that means determinantly that it has to be a centralized state. It just means the government, whatever governing authorities there are, it's to punish the bad and reward the good. And so what better picture than we have here in this quote here, where it says that the king could not wield the sword of justice until the humblest of his subjects placed the weapon in his hand. And then think back to natural law, treating others the way you want to be treated, i.e. love. And ultimately, that is what a jury is doing. If you don't want to be on the receiving end of a jury, then don't steal from your neighbor. Don't murder people. Don't defraud. Don't be dishonest, because that's when you're going to find yourself in front of a jury. And the king is going to sit there with the sword waiting until the jury says that one. Rodent dung. What does churl mean? That's a class of people in the Middle Ages. I've not done an exhaustive look into all of the different types, but someone has. Moving on. By the way, that quote was from Sir Francis Palgrave's Rise and Progress of the English Constitution. Moving on, it is perfectly evident that in all these courts, the jurors were the judges. This is now Spooner's commentary. And determined all questions of law for themselves, because the only alternative to that supposition is that the jurors took their law from sheriffs, bailiffs, and stewards, of which there's not the least evidence in history, nor the least probability in reason. It is evident also that they judged independently of the laws of the king for the reasons before given, that is, that the authority of the king was held in very little esteem. And secondly, that the laws of the king not being printed, and the people being unable to read them if they had been printed, must have been, in a great measure, unknown to them, and could have been received by them only on the authority of the sheriff, bailiff, or steward. if laws were to be received by them on the authority of these officers, the latter would have imposed such laws upon the people as they pleased. Sod this says a churl was a medieval peasant. Appreciate that. But here Spooner makes a logical argument that if the bailiff, sheriff, and stewards of the court were dictating to the jury what the law actually was, and the jury had no choice but to go along with it, then you are opening the door for a tremendous amount of mini despotism. And actually, that ends up being the case a little bit later on. We'll see that here in a little bit. The fact that in that dark age, so many of the principles of natural equity, as those then embraced in the common law, should have been so uniformly recognized and enforced by juries as to have become established by general consent as the law of the land. And the further fact that this law of the land was held so sacred that even the king could not lawfully infringe or alter it, but was required to swear to maintain it, are beautiful and impressive illustrations of the truth that men's minds, even in the comparative infancy of other knowledge, have clear and coincident ideas of the elementary principles and the paramount obligation of justice. The same facts also prove that the common mind and the general, or perhaps rather the universal conscience, as developed in the untrammeled judgments of juries, may be safely relied upon for the preservation of individual rights in civil society, and that there is no necessity or excuse for that deluge of arbitrary legislation with which the present age is overwhelmed under the pretext that unless laws be made, the law will not be known. A pretext, by the way, almost universally used for overturning instead of establishing the principles of justice. The point regarding the pretext that unless laws be made, the law will not be known is something that we'll get into, not this episode, but later on. Spooner then quotes Blackstone, and I consider this to be his silver bullet in his argument that juries were courts of conscience, rather than just regurgitating whatever the law, arbitrarily determined by the king was. But there is one species of courts constant. This is quoting Blackstone. But there is one species of courts constituted by Act of Parliament in the City of London and other trading and populous districts, which in their proceedings so vary from the course of common law that they deserve a more particular consideration. Rodent Dung, I don't know how far you've been listening or how long you've been listening, but there's a famous quote that Spooner pulls out when Magna Carta was pushed upon him. He complained that the trial by jury clause, which is clause 39, made him king in name only, because the jury reserved the right to essentially nullify any law that he made that they felt went against natural law or common law. He wrote a letter to the Pope at the time, begging for the Pope to annul the Magna Carta, which he did. So the Magna Carta was actually annulled only less than 3 months after it was signed. But a jury has, like, a person can be brought before a jury and can by the letter of the law, they're guilty. But if the jury, even if one person on the jury says, hey, I don't think that should be a law, that's a violation of our natural rights. Think of how many laws violate even the Bill of Rights, which is a limited attempt at trying to delineate some of our natural rights. But the jury can be like, hey, that law shouldn't exist. That law is actually tyranny. And therefore they can acquit that person, thus nullifying the law, preserving that person's liberty, and then setting the precedent going forward that if the government wishes to have people enforce its laws, it needs to make laws in accordance with natural law. And we'll get into more on that later about how unnecessary a centralized legislative body actually is. Spooner makes some wonderful commentary to that effect. But going back to Blackstone, referring to a certain type of court that was established in London. I forgot the century this was in. Well, he says here the first of these. So this might have been contemporary to Blackstone, which would have been the 1700s. So he's referring to the Court of Requests or Courts of Conscience for the recovery of small debts. So these were courts that were established for, basically small claims court, petty courts. The first of these was established in London so early as the reign of Henry VIII by an act of their Common Council, which, however, was certainly insufficient for that purpose and illegal until confirmed by statute, however you read their code. It has since been explained and amended by another statute. The constitution of these courts is this: 2 aldermen and 4 commoners sit twice a week to hear all causes of debt not exceeding the value of 40 shillings. And Rundung, I see you came in with the raid. Not a problem. It's nice that you caught me live. I usually do these, well, about half and half now, or I do some of these recorded just based on my life schedule and such, but I'm able to do it live tonight. So good to see you. Welcome, and glad you're here. So this is not to exceed the value of 40 shillings, which they examine in a summary way by the oath of the parties or other witnesses, and make such order therein as is consonant to equity and good conscience. Diverse trading towns and other districts have obtained acts of parliament for establishing in them courts of conscience upon nearly the same plan as that of the city of London. So these are these special courts that were created to handle these small and petty things. They used to be the prerogative of your different courts that were in existence in the Anglo-Saxon days. I think Courts Leet might have been the one that handled this type of stuff. So they were established, these special courts, by Parliament, and they were governed by conscience, not statute. So that part, at least the conscience part, where they had correct. But instead of being a randomly selected jury, instead they were a selected bureaucracy. You had 2 aldermen and then 4 commoners. What this did by creating a selected bureaucracy was create essentially courts of tyranny in these smaller cases, especially with people that were lower class, didn't have the funds in order to endure prolonged legal proceedings. And the impetus for these courts even being created in the first place was the court system was already clogged. And so getting any sort of remedy, especially for smaller amounts, was a long and drawn out process. And people complained then that the courts were, terrible. So they came up with these other courts, but they quickly got bogged down in their own bureaucratic nonsense. And people complained that this bureaucracy, because of their large discretionary powers, it created a petty tyranny in a set of standing commissioners. Such was this tyranny that one county, Middlesex County, cast off these courts entirely and instead resurrected the ancient 100 courts on their own. And this is from Blackstone again. And we may with satisfaction observe that this experiment has been tried and succeeded in the populous county of Middlesex, which might serve as an example for others. Blackstone further records, and I do have a slide for this. He records that a special county court shall be held at least once a month in every 100. That is it's not a county; it's a group of 100 houses. In every 100 of the county of Middlesex by the county clerk. 2, that's 12 freeholders of that 100 qualified to serve on juries and struck by the sheriff shall be summoned to appear at such court by rotation, so as none shall be summoned oftener than once a year. And the third thing they did, Lizzie Boston, I think it's a different Middlesex County, but I would be willing to bet money that your Middlesex County was named in honor of this Middlesex County. Maybe you could start this in yours. Thirdly, Blackstone records that in all causes not exceeding the value of 40 shillings, the county clerk and 12 suitors, jurors, shall proceed in a summary way, examining the parties and witnesses on oath without the formal process anciently used, and shall make such order therein as they shall judge agreeable to conscience. What a remarkable pushback against Parliament's predictably ill-fated legal remedy. What would happen today if a single county, I nominate Lizzie Boston's county, but what would happen today if a single county here in the U.S. similarly revived the ancient courts of the Anglo-Saxons and told the corrupt legal system to get bent? Spooner's point in highlighting this experiment was that as a revival of the ancient courts, the juries judged by conscience, thus providing evidence that at the time of this experiment, it was acknowledged that such was the manner of adjudication by juries. That has been Spooner's whole point that we are talking about in this episode tonight. Last week, we looked at the weakness of regal authority, and tonight we've looked at Spooner's evidence for why juries were courts of conscience. And we're following him along as he constructs his historical case. And ultimately, that the jury is the final tribunal which a prospective law must satisfy. I've mentioned we are in chapter 3, which is entitled Additional Proofs of the Rights and Duties of Jurors. And as I mentioned, tonight we're covering the courts of conscience. And we have within us a God-given ability to discern truth and justice. And that is what we are expected to lean on when we sit on a jury. Next week, we are going to examine the oaths of jurors in section 5. We'll skip forward, or that's section 3. We'll skip forward to section 5, cover the oaths of judges. And then we'll conclude chapter 3 with section 6, the oaths of kings. Anyone who has listened to this show for any length of time will know Spooner argues, I wholeheartedly agree with him, that oaths are effectively meaningless, but as they are recorded, they're useful by allowing us to discover what jurors, judges, and kings were sworn to do. And therefore, we can add one more layer to any rebuttal against the statists who would strip this power, this awesome power of trial by jury away from us. I've made the point before, and I'll make it again, that if you notice, all of the hullabaloo is all about getting out the vote, but not a lot of people talk about what you're allowed to do as a member of the jury. We are going to get to as well, once we get to the chapter entitled The Juries of Today Are Illegal, where I'm going to go through what I found as far as how juries have been subverted. But we've got a few Rumble rants. I'll go through these real quick. We've got Polymathanon for $10. Well done, brother. Great show and content. I deeply appreciate that. And then he says in the chat, voting is fake. And yes, it is. Well, you are actually doing, you are going someplace. You are physically doing something. But the thought that, and credit for good or for bad, depending on your perspective on it, credit Chris Paul for really pushing this issue hard. That the idea that control over economies worth trillions of dollars is left into the hands of just some random chance of how people happen to vote, if you understand the enemy that we're up against, is it's hard to accept that as a reality. Matt VK, good to see you, brother. $20. It's because of this show that I've declared myself co-POTUS. I think that's what I'll add in there, for and by the people means. The government listens to us, the co-POTUSes. That's tongue-in-cheek, but 100% correct. Of, for, and by the people is trial by jury. Because trial by jury, as I keep using the word because Spinner uses the word, it's a tribunal. We have other tribunals that a law has to pass through in order to become the enforceable code of the land. You have the House, you have the Senate, and you have the executive branch, and you have the judicial branch. There's 4 there, and then we have trial by jury. It has to pass the trial by jury as the final boss, as it were. Lion of Britain, Jonathan, have you seen what they are doing to trial by jury in Britain today? You made this comment last week, and I have not seen what they're doing. Can you enlighten me to that effect in the next couple of minutes? I'm about to sign off here. Saw this. You're very kind. $10 from Tropical Rocket. Deflation is not something to be feared, how the power class tells it. Rather, deflation after the Civil War is basically what created the American middle class. That's I've not looked into it in that angle. I know that I did an episode on this a month or so ago, that the expansion of the United States into the western part of the country was funded by British creditors through the channels of guys like JP Morgan. And every so often they would do as they did in 1836 and 7. They would pinch credit, cause a market collapse. And during market collapses, wealth isn't destroyed. It's just redistributed into fewer hands. And it would, these little credit blips that they would cause in the 1870s, I think there was one in 1890-ish, somewhere in that decade, would cause a lot of the railroad companies to collapse. Well, the rail is still there, so they get bought up into larger and larger conglomerates that were basically financed and effectively owned, therefore, by British creditors, which is how the British financial institutions effectively owned America leading up into World War I, which is probably the reason why we got involved in World War I, because, as Proverbs says, the borrower is slave to the lender. They effected a switch over, though. They moved the city of London essentially to New York City once they formed the Fed. And this goes back to the point that I made during those episodes, somewhere in the 8 or 9 episode range, that the Spooner writing 43 years before the creation of the Federal Reserve highlights that the problem that we all point to the Federal Reserve as being the source of, it's actually a problem that they were instrumental in streamlining. It goes back to the borrowing and taxing clauses or powers of Congress, which, coupled with the speech and debate clause, makes them untouchable and makes it so that they have the authority to leverage us out multiple generations to borrow, knowing that they'll be able to tax us. That power existed long before the Federal Reserve was created. That's how basically the British government or the British financial institutions were able to take over the United States. That, I'm sure, played a role in the creation of the middle class as well. You can tax a middle class. You need a middle class for the purpose of taxes. And they need the taxes as a justification, or they need to be able to borrow in order to justify the taxes, and they all get rich in doing so. Burning Brights in the chat, it is literally treason. And I would love to stick around, but he has a driveway to shovel, so he better get to it. Thank you all so much for joining me. Next week, as I said, we'll be talking about oaths. They're meaningless, but they're useful in understanding what they were swearing to. And I appreciate you all being here. I'll see you all next week.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.